As I've gone over many times on this channel, combining different movie genres can be a very difficult and complex thing. Because on the one hand, mixing certain genres happens all the time, and usually turns out very well. While on the other hand, there are other genres that can almost never be mixed together and actually turn out good in the end. But there is also a third camp, which is genres that have absolutely no business being lumped together, but actually do work surprisingly well nonetheless. And perhaps the best example of that out there is what's known as the war comedy. Because when you really look at it, war is often treated as an extremely serious and tragic subject, as it should be. So trying to turn it into a comedy seems like a recipe for an insensitive disaster, right? Well, the answer is most definitely yes, if done wrong, but when done right, the results can actually be anything but. And today, I'd like to go over a few movies that best demonstrate how a war comedy can work, since in theory it relies on a concept involving two genres that seem to outright contradict each other. And there will be spoilers for some of the movies mentioned ahead, so in case there's something you do not want ruined, you should probably be on the lookout. I won't be giving out any other spoiler warnings in this video. Okay, so to put it simply, what separates war comedies that work from the ones that don't is that the ones that get it right either still respect the inhuman tragedy that's going on and just want to put a lighter spin on it, or actively want to say something with it that doesn't necessarily have to do with war itself. And above all, never plays the actual tragedy and inhumanity for laughs itself. And a great example of this would be Tropic Thunder, because the whole thing is just one big parody of Hollywood courtesy of Ben Stiller, and absolutely no opportunity is missed either. But the reason he had the comedy center around actors making a war movie was because he was making fun of actors he knew that had done war movies and talked about how much they came to understand what soldiers go through after reading up on and living like them for a few days. And needless to say, he found a mentality like that to be extremely pretentious and insensitive, which is why he takes a bunch of actors with the same mentality and places them in a real war-type situation to show that these actors know nothing of what it really feels like to be a soldier of war. To put it simply, Tropic Thunder is one big satire across the board, but the reason it works as a war comedy specifically is because it's deliberately tearing down the glory, bravery, and heroism that war movies can evoke on the cast and audience, and plays their various reactions for laughs, rather than playing their terror of being out of their element straight. But again, the important thing to remember is that all these jokes are at their expense, because they were stupid enough to believe that just because they were playing soldiers, that they knew what it felt like to actually be one. And that's why the movie works so well, because it's actually being very respectful to the people who fought in wars and all the tragedy and inhumanity that ensued by having these idiots realize that they have no idea what the characters they're playing are actually going through. And what also helps is that they aren't fighting in an actual war so much as just fighting drug dealers, which also helps drive home the parody aspect by having clearly defined good guys and bad guys, as well as not having to depict any actual tragedy so that it can stay the light satire that it's trying to be, while also very much making its point about people believing that they can know what war is like without actually being in one, needing a serious reality check. Or for a different but no less effective example of that, take the classic Stalag 17, which, for those of you who don't know, is about American prisoners of war's day-to-day life stuck in a German prison camp. Now, first off, the play that this movie was based on was written by two people who actually served in a German POW camp during World War II, and many of the characters are based to varying degrees off of real-life people they knew while at the camp. But the point is, it's not exactly a dark movie, with plenty of comical gags and hijinks to be had. But part of the reason it works in this case is not only because it's, funny, but also because, as I just touched on, it's all true to life. I mean, what did American prisoners of war do in German prison camps when they weren't trying to escape? Trying to do everything they could to cope and keep their morale up. Because let's face it, it's human nature to try and find some kind of silver lining, so soldiers did often resort to childish means to keep their spirits up. And one of the best examples that shows just how brilliant this movie is in depicting that is the phonograph scene. I mean, these are literal prisoners of war. They live a terrible life, can do nothing to help their fellow men fighting in the war, and have no idea how long they'll be stuck there. And yet, the moment a patriotic song starts playing, their morale goes through the roof and everybody starts celebrating as if the war was won. It just goes to show what these men will do to not have their spirits broken by the enemy, and that no matter what happens, they'll keep fighting in their own way to the end. And this is even true of the main character himself, because while extremely cynical and thrown under the bus by his fellow men, he still ultimately proves himself to be a loyal American and does the right thing. Sure, he expects to gain a lot from it, but the point still remains. What I'm saying here is, by keeping the movie lighter, it actually does a service to the men that really had to live in these camps by both showing in no uncertain terms all the horrible things they had to go through, but also how they were able to keep from breaking regardless of that. And that's the other reason this movie works so well. Because even though it's pretty light and funny most of the time, it knows exactly when to get serious. The very real danger they're always in, the threat the spy poses to everybody, the brutal murder of two soldiers trying to escape, how traumatized Joey really is after seeing 8 of his fellow men torn to shreds in a plane crash, the main character being unfairly beaten after they're convinced he's the spy, and the entire climax where the life of a soldier is on the line and the real spy is finally busted. All of this is played dead straight and treats it with all the gravitas and respect that it deserves. To put it simply, just because the movie is funny doesn't mean it glorifies war or makes fun of it. Because, as I just said, it knows exactly when to be funny and when it's time to get serious, and never mixes them up. And as a result, it paints a pretty grim picture of what living in one of those camps was like. Trying to find fun and humor in a dangerous situation while knowing full well that problems and threats are looming at every turn, as befitting the fact that it was written by two people who actually had to live through it. And because of that, it allows it to be pretty funny, but also unquestionably respectful at the same time. because all the comedy comes directly from the characters themselves, never from the situations. And the same can also be said for a movie like Kelly's Heroes, though for pretty much the opposite reasons. Because this movie instead depicts a bunch of soldiers fed up with their thankless job, made worse by incompetent higher-ups, and instead decide to use the war as a way to line their own pockets by stealing a bunch of gold from the Germans before the Americans can find out it exists. And in this case, the reason it all works is specifically because it's sympathizing with the common soldier that had to endure the absolute worst a human should ever have to endure and got paid and rewarded the bare minimum for it, if at all. And to that end, it not only depicts the titular heroes as extremely justified in their attempted heist, but also goes the extra mile of depicting the high command that got all the glory but were never involved in the actual combat as a bunch of incompetent idiots, to the point that even a spaced-out proto-hippie is a better tacticianer than them. To put it simply, for any soldier that was ever left frustrated by their lot in life, this movie is the ultimate escapist fantasy. But what also helps the movie in this department is that, similar to Staglag 17, it knows exactly when to get serious and does not pull its punches in depicting the realities of war. Sure, at some points it almost frames it like an action movie, but other times the brutal tragedy and depravity is on full display with absolutely no glorification whatsoever. Heck, even the whole premise is pretty much one big takedown of the idea that being a soldier is in any way fun or glorious. And that's the other thing about it. The fact that it's in many ways more a heist movie than a war movie, which helps justify how it depicts certain aspects of the war. Because in the end, it's a lot more about getting to the gold and what they have to do to get it than the war itself, even if it makes sure to remind the viewer every once in a while that there's nothing to glorify about what it is they're going through. But seriously, you know a movie is doing something right when it can have a character as hilarious as Oddball in a war movie and have it work. And just like with Kelly's Heroes, that's also a strength of The Secret of Santa Vittoria. Because, to go over it quickly, the movie is about a small Italian village that decides to save their livelihood by hiding their valuable wine from the retreating Germans. But it's actually a pretty light movie, and as I went over in another video, which you can find a link in the description to, that's definitely all to the good. But similar to Kelly's Heroes, one of the reasons the lighter tone works is because it's not really about the war. Instead, it's a lot more about the individual characters and their newfound courage in the face of a potentially very dangerous situation. So as a result, the fact that it focuses more on comedy and mostly glosses over the more horrible and inhumane acts of war does make sense and can be forgiven. Especially because, once again, it still treats the threat the Germans pose and the terrible things they can and might do dead seriously, in contrast to almost everything else. But to give one more, but extremely different example of all of this, there's Stripes. And let's face it, this is one movie that was made strictly for comedy and nothing else. Even the one character that's played straight still has plenty of funny moments. But part of the reason this movie works is for that exact reason, because it wears its intentions on its sleeve. It tells the viewer outright that this is a send-up of the military and is to make fun of them. And it all works pretty well, mainly because for the most part it always remains in good taste. But what also helps is that the movie was made during a period when the United States wasn't involved in any wars, which helps make the movie's nature easier to swallow. And as a result, it's also then allowed to manufacture its own war, which it can then play for all the absurd comedy at once because it's not based off anything real. To put it simply, while Stripes, unlike pretty much all the other examples, uses its premise as a way to mock and satirize the military to the highest degree, it still works mainly because it makes that very clear from the start, and because that mockery is clearly not supposed to be taken seriously. And to its credit, even a movie as silly as Stripes does take a few moments to show proper respect to the people who command the military. And looking at it that way, Stripes may be a good-natured takedown of the United States Army, but even it is respectful towards it in its own way, especially because it portrays the people in it more as the idiots and not the institution itself, which is what gets those few aforementioned respectful moments. And in a testament to how well it pulled that off, Army recruitment actually soared after the release of the film, which only goes to show just how much the movie had its heart in the right place, even though it was doing anything but glorifying military life. But let's not kid ourselves here. This movie was made to be funny first, and everything and anything else second. It just knew how to do it and what lines it shouldn't cross. Now I could probably bring up various other examples of war comedies that manage to be both funny and respectful, but I think I've more than proven my point here. Which is that it's not actually all that hard for one to pull off a war comedy, so long as it shows respect and knows where to draw the line. Because once again, some may argue that war is no place to try and set up the basis for funny situations, but as all the previous examples have shown, there are ways to do it without taking away from the horror and tragedy that's inherent to the whole thing. But once again, it has to be done in a very respectful and mindful fashion, otherwise it will never turn out right. But when it is done right, the results can be both pretty good and effective, as all the previous examples prove. Which all just goes to show that sometimes, even the most unlikely of genre combinations can be a pretty good match if one knows what they're doing with them. Okay, I think that pretty much covers everything. So now why don't all of you tell me? Do you believe that the war comedy is a surprising blending of genres that can turn out pretty well as long as it's respectful to the horrors of war? Or do you believe that they are always in bad taste no matter what? Please let me know in the comments below. And I understand that I may have broached a sensitive topic or two, so please understand that this video was made only to try and explain why certain war comedies work as well as they do, and that no offense or belittling of any events was in any way intended. And also keep in mind, you are in no way obligated to agree with me on this video if you don't want to. You can feel about this or any other topic we discuss here that you want to, and if you think I got something, or even everything, backwards, that is completely okay. And thank you all for watching. I greatly appreciate all of it, and I hope to see you all next time.